And because we were licensed by whoever was licensing us, when the kids came into our residential program, we had to do the smart thing, and we took all their razor blades away. Well, you'd be surprised how quickly urges for self-injury decreased, right? But all we were doing was cue removal. All we were doing was taking things away that were stimulating self-injury. And of course, you know, the kids would say, I have to tell you, you have the best program in the world because I don't feel like self-injuring anymore. Until we represented the razor blades, and then it all came back. So when you're assessing self-injury, you really do have to assess how much of it is being controlled by stimulants. So these are the kids who go into the bathroom and they see a razor blade and they say, well, I just saw the razor blade and I started to cut myself. That's a really good piece of evidence that this is respondent, and that you're going to have to do some exposure work to razor blades to get people so that the urges for self-injury don't show up every time they see a razor blade. And you have to make sure that you're not patting yourself and your programs on the back when you do cue removal, because that's actually not treatment, that's just cue removal. Okay? Another and I think this is more of a secondary function of self-injury, is that it controls interpersonal relationships. If you're thinking of this as a terrible strategy to control your friends by saying, if you don't come out to dinner with me tonight, I'm going to cut myself. Okay, but there are, especially, I've seen this in early to mid-adolescence, we'll use this as a way of trying to control and manage a situation, an interpersonal situation. It generally is a strategy that works in the short run and then very quickly blows up in the moderate to long term, because most kids aren't interested in hearing about somebody's self-injury. So that happens. Okay. And lastly, I think self-injury is a communication of distress. It is a sign that something is really wrong here. It is a time to, I sat with, this happened about 6 years ago, and this is true. I sat with a mother and a daughter, and the girl's arms were really all cut up, really, really, really awful. And I said to the mom, well, God, look at your daughter's arms, it must be really painful for you to see. And she said, well, no, because I understand all adolescents cut themselves. And I said, well, actually, that's not true. The reason I'm raising this now is the mother did not see this as a sign of trouble in her kid. She saw this as normative adolescent behavior. And we really needed this was some psychoeducation to get her to, what I asked her to do was go to the literature and see if it was really true that most adolescents self-injure. You don't have to go to the literature for that. I can tell you most adolescents don't self-injure. Here you go. Okay. So we're going to try to assess whether this is a suicide attempt. We're going to try to assess the function of self-injury. And then we need to start thinking about what is the person's core beliefs. These are the things that we hold near and dear and that are usually practically immutable to change unless we really bring some important change strategies to them. These are things that we maintain, beliefs that we maintain in spite of evidence to the contrary. Okay? So we all have them. We all have these core beliefs, but they're very difficult to shift. So one of the more prominent core beliefs is, I am someone who needs to be punished. Now, where it breaks down is when you ask somebody why they need to be punished. Then what you get is, because I'm a bad person, because of all sorts of sort of rather broad and not particularly targeted kinds of behaviors. But I need to be punished is a really, really very common feeling that self-injurers have. Then there is the kids who say, I'm the kind of person that's much better at managing physical pain than emotional distress. And I think that's true. I think that is actually true about these about these people. Then there is a small group of kids, but an important group of kids, who use self-injury as a suicide prevention strategy. So I'm someone who is struggling with suicide, and when we're struggling with suicide, it's kind of a mixed bag, because sometimes when we think about suicide, it's an escape behavior. That is, we feel better thinking about suicide because we're saying to ourselves, you know, there is a way out of this misery. Okay? For some kids, though, what happens is they feel really lousy when they're feeling suicidal. And then they cut themselves and they don't feel as suicidal anymore because they've made them feel better. This is an important assessment to make, because if you treat someone successfully for self-injury who is using this as a suicide prevention strategy, what you're going to have is suicidal behavior spike, which is never a good thing. Okay? So if the person is using this as a way to calm themselves down and move away from suicide, you really need to intervene pretty quickly so that you can help them develop the requisite skills to manage suicidal thinking and behavior. For a group of kids, and again, I'm going to put this in more early adolescence. I should just say, one of my things about these conferences when we talk about teenagers, we talk about teenagers as if it was some monolithic developmental stage. But I'll bet you nobody in this room gets fooled between the difference between a 13-year-old girl and a 19-year-old girl. Anybody can't figure that out, right? They have different kind of needs, they have different kinds of things. But in early adolescence, you're going to find kids who identify themselves as self-injurers, and they have found a group of other self-injurers, and they're deeply embedded in this social context. And they often will report that the only people who really understand them is their friends, and the adult world is sort of clueless. I can tell you that trying to undercut their friendships rarely works. When they get better, they'll choose different friends. So I would not parents spend a lot of time, blaming other kids for their children's self-injury. And that's just probably not the case. But what I have found is that when someone stops self-injuring, they're no longer that interested in hanging around with self-injurers. That just seems to make sense. And then this follows up on the need to be punished in some ways. These are people who have deep-seated senses of self-loathing. They just really cannot tolerate themselves. They are absolutely disgusted and repulsed by themselves. And these kinds of thoughts about oneself and these kinds of behaviors are very difficult and take some time to get sort of undercut. But I can tell you, and I don't want to go too far on this, but there is a way to talk with someone who has this idea that they are just a horrible human being. and it's simply to ask them things like, if you ask a kid who self-injures, for example, are you a good friend? Are you empathic? They are likely to say, no, I'm not. However, if you say to a kid, in the last month, have you done one thing where you've demonstrated that you've been a good friend? They can often find that one thing. And this is the kind of inquiry that is probably going to, over time, change this view of themselves. So ask it in this way. Have you, I'm a bad person. Okay. Well, in the last week, have you done anything good? And inevitably, your first response from a kid is going to be no. But then ask them to think about it for a little bit. And they will come up with something. And this actually begins to undercut this deeply held and entrenched view of themselves. All right. Now, I don't think you have to do all of these assessments every time you're meeting with somebody who's self-injured, even for the first time. But I do want you to have some idea about assessing the contextual factors, co-occurring psychiatric illnesses, the functions and the controlling variables. Contextual factors, where and when. Okay, does this person routinely cut themselves in their room at night? Are they the kinds of kids that walk into a room and look around for sharp objects? Do they bring sharp objects to school with them? If they have multiple methods of self-injury, do they all have the same function? I treated a girl who, when she had kind of general interpersonal problems, she cut herself. When she got herself involved in sexual behavior that crossed her values, which she did quite frequently, she burned herself. So the two behaviors, while seemingly both met criteria for non-suicidal self-injury, were prompted by very different behaviors, and it's useful to know that. Okay, I always ask, when was the first time you self-injured? Very often, kids will know. I always ask the person after you self-injured, were you surprised by how you felt? And especially with the mid to younger adolescents, yes, they were, because oftentimes, often it may be too strong. There is this killing yourself by slitting your wrists, which, by the way, is not probably the best way to kill yourself, but kids do this. They slit their wrists and they feel better. And that's one of the ways that kids learn about self-injury. You want to ask them, has the self-injury changed in frequency over time? Are you doing it more? Are you doing it less? There are people who cut themselves once a year. There are people who cut themselves once a day. There are people who cut themselves multiple times a day. You want to find out, is the adolescent needing to self-injure more frequently in each episode of self-injury? Okay, so there are kids who start off self-injuring and they have maybe make 1 or 2 cuts, and then 6 months later they need to make 15 cuts to get the same result. So when you have a kid like that, you need to start thinking of, does the self-injury also start to parallel an addiction model? I mean, is this person getting addicted to this behavior? And as I said before, when you walk into a room, do you immediately look for the things that you can hurt yourself with? Or do you carry things to school just in case? Okay? We're going to also have to look at the severity of the self-injury, in part because people who really are attacking their bodies, especially, for example, cutting on one's breasts or genitalia, is often linked to sexual abuse or neglect, or more traumatic, someone who's had a really pretty traumatic life. So I don't want to say if somebody's really ripping themselves apart that they've had a trauma. All I'm saying is if someone is really attacking their body, it is something that you need to think about. Is there a trauma here? The location of the injuries. For example, face cutters, which is really pretty rare, there often are people who are developing a psychosis, or I've seen this with young girls who have had a sexual abuse history, who are trying to make themselves look less attractive. Okay? But if somebody's face cutting, that's I think a time to start looking at comorbid diagnoses. Okay, so we have co-occurring psychiatric disorders. We're going to need to assess that. Borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, depression, all of these diagnostic categories, you can find self-injury. Although for sure, in borderline personality disorder, it's one of the criteria. So keep in touch with that. In the pervasive developmental disorders, the kind of headbanging and cutting that you see actually doesn't really follow the model of non-suicidal self-injury. It is something a little bit different, but I wanted to put that on there just for you to keep in your mind. All right. The clinical stance, okay. How many of you are treating self-injuries? Okay, great. How many of you are getting freaked out by self-injury? Not anymore, right? So just to sort of review this, I think you need to just assume a matter-of-fact attitude about the behavior. Behavior is just behavior. Non-judgmental, this is what it is, let's take a look at it. And it is also true that all behavior has consequences. Some are short-term, some are long-term, some are positive, some are negative. And in your work with the kid, you want to figure out, okay, so what are the pros of self-injury? How's this working for you? What are the cons of self-injury? That is, what you want to start doing is walking alongside your patient and saying, yeah, this is a problem. Now, having said that, as a DBT therapist, you cannot get into DBT unless you're willing to target self-injury. So you can get into DBT if you say, yeah, I got all these other problems, but self-injury is not one I'm going to work on. I'm going to work on everything else. That does not work in DBT. It will work in, I think, Alan may know better than I or somebody else, but I think I'm not sure that there is any other treatment that takes such a hard line about self-injury. And I'm actually glad that we do, because if I'm self-injuring, I'm avoiding understanding my problem, that is, assessing my problem, and I'm avoiding implementing solutions. Okay? So I've got to get on top of this, or it's going to take me much longer to solve all the other problems in my life. So self-injury is a very, very high clinical target in DBT. So what we're going to try to do is be curious without judgment. And this just takes a little bit of practice. So sometimes I tell this to parents and to clinicians. Think of yourself as an anthropologist, that you've come across a human tribe that is engaging in a behavior that just doesn't seem to make sense. Where does it fit in? And if you bring a kind of curiosity, leave the judgment behind, you're going to do a whole lot better with these kids than if you come in from a judgmental position of this has to stop. All right, so just to review, I'm sure many of you know this about DBT and about patients, that every moment of the day, our patients are doing the best they can. Every moment of the day, you're all doing the best you can. Now, some of you may be thinking, are you kidding me? You should have seen the fight I had with my partner before I got here today. I was at my worst and they were no better. All I would say to you is, in that moment, that was the best you could do. I believe that to be true, because if you could do better, you would have. Okay? So people are doing the best they can. And they have to try harder and be more motivated to change. And motivation is not the patient's problem. Motivation is our problem. That is, it is our job to get the patients motivated. Okay? Now, here's the good news and the bad news. We're sometimes going to fail on that. We may fail on that more than we want to. But it is our job, to simply say, well, the person's just not motivated. Nothing I can do. There's no motivation here. Well, not really. What you need to say is, I have tried everything I could figure out how to get this person motivated to stop cutting, and I haven't been able to do it. I failed. Remember, in DBT, the patient never fails. We can fail as therapists, the treatment can fail, but the patient can't fail. Okay? This is so terribly important. In some ways, psychiatry is the only medical profession where we say the patient fails. All right? If you have cancer and you take the treatment and you die, no one says, I don't think they really wanted to get better. Because if they really wanted to get better, they would have done X, Y, or Z. But in psychiatry, I think it's happening less. We have blamed the patients. And with adolescents, we generally blame the parents, which I have to tell you, I did a lot of until I had my own children. That is an eye-opener. That's when things change. Okay. Our patients may not have caused all of their problems, but they are responsible for solving them. That's true for all of us. Have you noticed that no one is jumping up and saying, I'll solve your problems for you? You have to solve your problems. So, listening to why your parents are horrible and they don't treat you right, that's all fine. What are you, adolescent, going to do to make your life better, given that these are the parents you've got? We can try to do a little change with them, but this is what you got. Okay. So, all right. Of course, assessment and treatment works better, and actually I would make a case in some ways only works, if you can forge some sort of collaborative relationship. And that really will happen if you can remain non-judgmental, curious, and compassionate. Not the easiest thing to do when working with a borderline adolescent. It is our job to hold on to them. And it's our job to really, while collaboration takes more than one person by definition, it really is our job to set the stage for collaboration. It's not the patient's job. I mean, people who come to us have no idea how psychotherapy is supposed to work. How many, don't raise your hand, how many of you have been in psychotherapy? How many of you, when you were in psychotherapy, actually got told right up front, this is what you have to do, this is how it's going to work, da-da-da-da-da? When I first got to McLean 100 years ago, I asked my first supervisor, I said, all right, what do I do? I mean, what do I say? And he said, three things, he said. First, you have to tell them what the billing situation is. Then you have to tell them about your cancellation policy. Okay, check, I can do that. And third, you have to tell them about the fundamental rule. Anybody remember the fundamental rule? This was Freud. Right? Fundamental rule was say what's ever on your mind without censoring. Well, that sounds good, but how the hell does that help? So anyway, our patients don't actually know what's going to happen in psychotherapy. They're usually told, listen, you'll tell somebody your problems and you'll feel better. Well, telling somebody your problems probably brings a little bit of relief. But I got to tell you, I have told people my problems, the same problems for 100 years here, and I'm not getting any better. It actually turns out that there are things that are required, that you actually have to do things differently, not just talk about the problem. We have to remember that minds are opaque. You actually can't read somebody's mind. You can only make somewhat of a guess about what's going on in there. And that's the stance of tentative curiosity that you really need to maintain with these kids. And while you are an expert about how minds work, they are an expert about their own minds. And so this becomes really can be quite a fruitful collaboration between two minds. Okay. So open and curious, certainty on your part or on the adolescent part is a cue for reappraisal. All right. Certainty in psychotherapy, if you are certain, now I have to qualify this, sometimes really we get certain and we're right. Oftentimes we get certain and we're dead wrong. Okay? So if you find yourself being quite certain about something, stand back, chuckle, and take another look at things. Certainty rarely belongs in treatment. And then therapists have to, and especially with self-injury and suicide, you have to have the courage to raise and confront issues which are impending treatment progress. Okay? You just have to be clear about that. So I was telling someone, recall earlier at dinner, I was doing some skills coaching of a parent in our partial hospital program, and he called me like 3 times. And every time I got off the phone with this guy, I was dysregulated. I was annoyed with him, I felt helpless, and it turns out that I'm not very good at hiding those things. And so he wrote an email to the clinician and said, I've been calling Hollander, but I got to tell you, it's a rather unfortunate conversation. we're having. I'm just not sure how well he likes me. And so, of course, the therapist passed on the email to me, and I wrote the guy back. And I said, you know, you are 100% right to think that I'm having trouble with you, because I am having trouble with you. And here's the trouble I'm having. You call me up, and I can't figure out what you want. I keep asking, can you help me understand what you want? And I can never understand what you want. So I get off the phone feeling frustrated and helpless. That's the problem I have with you. And he said, oh, you're not the first person who's told me this. And we were able to forge a relationship that has worked much better once I was able to confront the problem. And the problem wasn't him, the problem was me. Because I have to tell you, there were probably 90% of you in this room would not have had the same response that I had to this guy, believe it or not. I'm from New Jersey, and we want things clear and quick, and let's go. And I got 2 minutes. All right. And therapists really need to be skilled in validation. While it is not required in DBT, I really think before you introduce any change strategies, you better make sure that you have really validated the hell out of that person before you introduce change. Just to avoid, oh, you think this is easy. You think anybody can do this. Da-da-da-da-da. So validation before problem solving. With parents, 100% of the time, I'm always saying to them, validate before problem solving if you want your good ideas to be heard by your kid. If you don't want your good ideas to be heard by your kid, just problem solve. Okay. Well, I'm not sure that there's too much more I can tell you, except that I do want to say that you have to early on sell the idea that the self-injury is not in the service of the adolescent's long-term goals, which means, by the way, you actually have to have a discussion about what the person's long-term goals are. Right? But I cannot think of any profession in which cutting yourself actually is going to help you. So that's a pretty easy one. All right. Then we get a commitment. A commitment is not a promise, which you're going to have to work through with adolescents. I don't know in Spanish whether commitment and promise, how close they are, but a commitment is, what you're saying is, I'm going to work heart and soul to change this problem. A promise is, I'll never do it again. Do not take promises. Take commitment. And make sure that you troubleshoot the commitment, like what's going to go wrong. Because, you know, a lot of times the kid will say, oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, I'll stop cutting right now, no problem. All right, I'm going to have to stop because it says final aviso or something, and I don't speak Spanish. So, anyway, thank you very much for listening. I hope you'll.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Hollander. Thank you very much, Dr. Hollander. A continuación, vamos a presentar a ustedes, démosle la bienvenida al Dr. Alan Frusetti. Para presentar al Dr. Frusetti se encuentra con nosotros la compañera Mónica Valentín del programa de DBT del BISU de San Juan.
Gracias. Buenas tardes a todos. Sé que ya estamos, miren, en la recta final. Alan Frusetti obtuvo su maestría y doctorado de Psicología Clínica de la Universidad de Washington. Fue profesor en la Universidad de Nevada, en la cual también dirigió el programa de terapia dialéctica conductual desde el 1994 hasta el 2016. Actualmente ejerce como profesor en la Escuela de Medicina de Harvard. Además dirige los programas de Three East Boys y servicios familiares del Hospital de McLean en Harvard. Me perdí en Harvard. Ahora. Además, dirige los programas de Three East Boys y él mismo forma también parte de la Junta de Directores del National Education Alliance for Borderline Personality Disorder, la Sociedad Internacional para Terapia Dialéctica Conductual, así como el Instituto del Linehan. Ha publicado sobre más de 100 artículos de investigación, capítulos en libros y ha ofrecido conferencias en más de una docena de países acerca del trastorno de personalidad limítrofe, terapia dialéctica conductual e intervenciones familiares. Es el autor del libro, este libro está bien interesante, escúchenlo. Es el autor del libro The High Conflict Couple, A Dialectical Behavior Therapy Guide to Finding Peace, Intimacy and Validation. Yo creo que todos queremos un poco de eso en nuestras relaciones, ¿verdad? Así que nada, démosles la bienvenida. Gracias.
Muchas gracias.